our audience, everybody. It's great to see so many people interested in tonight's beauty salon. That is, of course, beauty in the built environment. We have a lot to get through tonight, and as with all salons, we really want you to stretch your thinking, examine your assumptions about this debate, and participate with us in getting under the skin of some of these thorny issues. Let me introduce the panel. Firstly, we will hear from Kati Garamani. She is a director at Make Architects and has worked in China and also in London on refurbishments such as the Hornsey Town Hall and other residential schemes. Next, we'll hear from Mark Hewitt, an architect, author, preservationist and historian. He's joining us from the United States this evening. He's written extensively on the nature of beauty as a moral ideal. So thank you so much, Mark, for coming all this distance from New York, and we look forward to hearing your views from across the Atlantic. The next speaker will be Mick Owens, researcher, writer and lecturer. Mick has extensive practical experience in London and other UK conurbations, not least working on the 2012 Olympics. And then currently with Bow Arts Trust, a leading provider of artist spaces across the city. And last but not least, Bob Tomlinson, a founding director of the Living Village Trust. This was established in 1993 to promote better urban development. So you can see we've been talking about this for some time. I'll ask each to present for just 10 minutes, and then we will invite you all to ask questions. Please use the chat function on Zoom if you're familiar with it. Raise a digital hand or just wave. We will invite the panel to respond to groups of questions, and then we'll come back out to you, the audience. We'll end this session with 2-minute summaries from each panelist, and I'll do my very best to ensure that you do all get to participate. So just before we get going with the panel, there is much to see in practice in our towns and cities around this subject of beauty in the built environment. To read in academia and in today's newspapers and government circles, beauty and building, not least in the government's current planning white paper, cites the word beauty a number of times, and the work of Roger Scruton's Beauty Commission is extensively referenced. This is not a new discussion. Prince Charles's famous or infamous carbuncle speech was way back in 1984. So in this momentous year of 2020, what is this all about? Can we rebuild society by building more beautifully? Are we besotted with imitations of a bygone age, or should we now be accepting that we need to return to just modest building? Indeed, with so much redundant floor space across our cities and towns, just today announcements about, it seems that retail shopping malls are redundant. So is beauty in building the right question today? So it'll be over to the panel to give us some insight, and we'll start with Kati, who's going to screen share some images as well. So if you go ahead, Kati, thank you so much.
Thanks, Sheila. Thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me. And I will start off by sharing my screen. Right, hopefully everyone can see that. Great. If I can make my screen move, there we go. So I'm sat in our studio in London. I wish I was in Liverpool in a pub with you all, as Pauline was describing, the salons usually are. But I'm going to take you through some of my ideas about beauty. As I knew I would be the first speaker this evening, I thought we should kick off proceedings by trying to define the term beauty. The dictionary defines beauty as the quality present in a thing or person that gives intense pleasure or deep satisfaction to the mind, whether arising from sensory manifestations as shape, color, sound, etc., a meaningful design or pattern, or something else, as a personality in which high spiritual qualities are manifest. In philosophical terms, the biggest debate in the theory of beauty is whether beauty is subjective, located in the eye of the beholder, or whether it's an objective feature of beautiful things. Just looking back to history, by the 18th century, the Scottish philosopher David Hume wrote, Beauty is no quality in things themselves. It exists merely in the mind which contemplates them, and each mind perceives a different beauty. One person may even perceive deformity, where another is sensible of beauty. And every individual ought to acquiesce in his own sentiment without pretending to regulate those of others. Fighting talk. However, if beauty is entirely subjective, then it seems that the word has no meaning, or that we're not communicating anything when we call something beautiful, except perhaps an approving personal attitude. Although different persons can of course differ in particular judgments, it is also obvious that our judgments often coincide to a remarkable extent. It would be odd or perverse for any person to deny that a perfect rose or a stunning sunset was beautiful. On the other hand, it seems pointless to say that beauty has no connection to subjective response or that it is entirely objective. That would seem to entail, for example, that a world with no perceivers could be beautiful or ugly, or perhaps that beauty could be detected by scientific instruments or measured in some way. Even if it could be, beauty would seem to be connected to subjective response. And though we may argue about whether something is beautiful, the idea that one's experiences of beauty might be disqualified as simply inaccurate or false might confuse some people as well as create hostility. We often actually regard each other's taste, even when it differs from our own, as professionally entitled to some respect. We're not suddenly going to resolve this theory of beauty in the next 10 minutes, but this ambiguity is interesting in that there is in that there can be consensus, but also that beauty is not necessarily measurable. Also, due to its subjective nature, one's perception of beauty can change over time. One simple example of this is St. Paul's Cathedral. As some of the architects in the audience might be aware, I don't know if this is an urban myth or not, but there's an often bandied tale that when Christopher Wren was first building the building, he had to put a giant hoarding around the construction site as there was huge public disapproval for his design. Intense criticism of his design continued once the cathedral had been completed. In his article about St. Paul's, the contemporary architecture critic Jonathan Glancy wrote, St. Paul's was barely a year old when the attacks began. What we accept as one of the greatest of all British buildings, crowned with one of the most inspiring domes of all, was suspicious and even meretricious stuff if you happen to be Anthony Ashley Cooper, 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury. In his letter concerning the arts or science of design, published in 1712, this prominent Whig politician condemned what he saw as an excessive and even vulgar form of design, Christopher Wren's very English Baroque, not least because this voluptuous style was associated with Rome and all things Catholic, and was therefore a very bad thing indeed in staunchly Protestant England. It's a very personal view of beauty. We now revere St. Paul's to the extent where we have created planning policy which protects views of the building and of other historic landmarks under what's called the London View Management Framework, which just is a diagram showing of specific views from various places around London to really make sure that the views of St. Paul's and the Dome are protected. So if we can't measure or define beauty despite centuries of discussion, what can we define? As architects, I think we can define good design. And in my opinion, that is what is defined in this report, Building Better, Building Beautiful. The report starts off with high ambitions of the importance of beauty within our environment and that we should reject ugliness. I think we would all say that we would agree with that. However, because of its nature, it is impossible to measure and quantify beauty. What the report actually ends up defining, in my opinion, is just good design. Things like placemaking and community, proportion and density, sustainability in all its aspects and landscape. I would like to propose that we would need to differentiate between good design and beautiful design, as one does not necessarily follow the other. Also, our perception of what is beautiful can change, as we saw in the perception of St. Paul's Cathedral. Or in more modern times, a more modern example might be in the public's perception of Richard Rogers Lloyd's building, which is now Grade 1 listed, even though when it was first built, it was called an oil rig, a factory, and a backdrop from Blade Runner. Equally, unfortunately, a building can be badly designed in that it doesn't perform its function well, doesn't relate to its setting or surroundings, and is probably not sustainable, but yet still be beautiful. I would suggest that these buildings are not something to be aimed for, as they're pointless follies rather than great buildings to be inhabited. As part of the planning system in the UK, and I think Sheila talked about this, or I think Pauline talked about Sheila doing this, many councils have design review panels, which are made up of architects and other design professionals, and review the design of buildings as they go through the planning system. Their remit is to provide the planning officers with their assessment of the design in order to add weight to the idea of good design beyond what is in planning policy. I've sat on one of these design review panels for over a decade, and I can say that what we definitely see are beautiful buildings which are well designed, as well as mediocre buildings which are badly designed, which are the two extremes on this diagram. So up here and down here, and actually mediocre design probably sits in the whole kind of element there. And these two kind of elements, these two categories are easy to assess and provide feedback and guidance on. The most difficult proposals are those which are good design, but they are in terms of all the quantifiable elements, so that are in the report, placemaking, community, all those things. But in the end, when you look at it, the effect can still be mediocre. These are the most difficult to actually pinpoint what is wrong with the design, because it's that unquantifiable element of the design. So in my opinion, the best way of creating beautiful and well-designed buildings is to invest in the design process itself, not necessarily the cost of the actual building. The cost of design in terms of time and money is merely a fraction of the overall cost of the project and the amount of time that a building will impact on its surroundings and its communities. Allowing architects proper time to design, investing in the planning system in terms of time and money for planning departments is the single best way to improve design. I would like to finish with one last example, which is this, bringing the conversation around to housing. It is important to note that this is last year's winner of the Sterling Prize, the Sterling Prize being one of the most prestigious architecture prizes. Well, it's the most prestigious architecture prize in the UK. And last year, it didn't happen this year because of COVID. It was won by this social housing scheme in Norwich. The scheme is by architects Michael Riches, and I just thought I would finish with a quote by David Michael. He says, "It is not often we're appointed to work on a project so closely aligned with what we believe matters, buildings people love which are low impact. We hope other local authorities will be inspired to deliver beautiful homes for people who need it the most at an affordable price." Hopefully I was within my 10 minutes, Sheila.
You were. Thank you so much, Catty. That was great. Really gets us off to a good start in terms of what we need to think about. So, so we're handing over next to Mark Hewitt. Mark, you just need to switch your mute button off. On. You need to. Mark, you need to unmute yourself.
Let me just see. Yes, now can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Good, okay. Well, thank you very much for having me on the panel from here near New York City, where we're not having much of a beautiful day. It's been raining cats and dogs for most of the morning. I'm going to talk about three things: beauty, nature, and what is called embodiment or embodied cognition. And I want to start out by simply saying that among architects, beauty has for at least a century been a dirty word. And most of us kind of know why that is the case. Part of the reason is that Le Corbusier the architect whom we've revered since our school days, talked about an engineer's aesthetic, an aesthetic that didn't involve beauty, but simply a kind of calculus of economic and functional criteria that engineers would use in making their objects, their airplanes and their automobiles. And because buildings were machines for living in, beauty didn't really matter much. But another reason that we don't take beauty seriously has to do with an Enlightenment philosophical bias, which we call Cartesian dualism, and that is that people are somehow rational. We're unlike animals, we have a portion of our brain that allows us to think very much like engineers think, in abstract ways that have nothing to do with either the environment or our bodies. Cartesian dualism has now been proven to be completely ungrounded in science, because brain science, neuroscience, has now proven that indeed the emotions, the environment, the body, the mind are all bound up together in one whole. And in fact, we don't have any rational capacity that makes us different than animals. Indeed, we think very much like animals, and we behave very much like animals in everything that we do. So in the sense that we have art, one might say that aesthetics, and that we make art, does that make us different from animals? Well, it turns out even that does not distinguish us from the animal kingdom, because as David O. Prum in a recent book called The Evolution of Beauty has proven, he's an ornithologist, animals do in fact have an aesthetic sense. Animals such as the flame bowerbird, the Pacific pufferfish, various birds that make sounds, all use ornament, essentially various kinds of ornament, including their feathers, including the sounds they make, even including environments that they make, like bowers. They use this ornament to attract mates, and their mates, in fact, use an aesthetic sense when they are choosing their essentially females choose the males that they want to mate with. So in fact, in the animal kingdom, ornament and beauty are essential. In fact, David O. Prum says that they have evolved with animals to give them a sense of what is more beautiful and what is less beautiful when choosing, making the most important choice in their lives, that is, whom to mate with. Now, we also have a problem with the idea that art is for the elites, and that art made by artists is about things other than beauty, critical theory, and art has to be cutting edge, and art has to comment on society, and art has to do this and that, but it doesn't necessarily have to be beautiful. Things that might have to be beautiful might include, say, dishes and a ring made by Tiffany, those sorts of things. And those are things that we call artisanal products. And of course, the Greeks didn't consider jewelry or pottery to be artisanal and painting to be art. There was no distinction actually up until approximately the French Revolution between the products of artisans and the products of what we call fine artists. And indeed, when architecture was categorized as among the fine arts by people like Denis Diderot and L'Alembert's Encyclopédie, architecture was in some ways put in the wrong category, because architecture is in fact an artisanal pursuit. It's involved in making things, but it was made into a fine art. And so we have been laboring under this, I think, false categorization for more than a century now, that artisans and artists do different things, that artisans may produce beautiful wares that we might buy because they're more beautiful than other things, but that artists needn't do that. So there are those kinds of biases that we live with today that we don't have to live with, that science is basically telling us we oughtn't to live with. And brain science has really led the way in all of this. And I wrote one of the first books, this is it right here, called Draw in Order to See, published just in 2020, on the relationship between design and brain science. And for various parts of the book, I do talk about the fact that there is some substantial research that is coming to prove that proportion, symmetry, and lots of things that are involved have been associated with aesthetics and beauty in past times, that these things may in fact have a scientific basis, that in fact we may prefer symmetrical things, we may prefer certain kinds of proportions to other kinds of proportions, certain kinds of ordering systems to other kinds of ordering systems, and so forth. So stay tuned for the brain science on these particular subjects. But the thing that really makes it us most in need of attending to brain science is what is called the concept of embodied cognition. And embodied cognition is simply the idea that the brain, the body, and the environment are all part of our cognitive apparatus. That in fact, when we think, and indeed even when our autonomic nervous system is in operation, our unconscious nervous system, we're constantly in touch with the environment and our bodies, and the fact that we have a body that has 2 arms and 2 legs and is symmetrical about its center, the fact that we have the kind of body that we have causes us to behave in certain ways, causes us to perceive the world in certain ways, and even causes us to judge things around us, including the beauty of things around us, in certain ways that are different from that of any other kind of creature, a crab, an octopus, etc. And we know, for instance, that octopi have about 40% of their brain is in their tentacles or their arms, and so they communicate with their environment in particular ways, just as we do. We on the other hand, have hands that have intelligence. Our hands are part of our brain in a sense, and so when we make drawings, when we touch things, when we create art, our hands are part of our thinking, and the environment is also part of our thinking. The other thing that is important in terms of embodied cognition is the fact that emotions contribute to all the judgments we make, that in fact our emotions are constantly affecting our behavior. We know about PTSD, we know about the fight or flight impulse, and we know that even in a time like this with a pandemic, we are in fact emotionally we're being bombarded with stresses that like any animal are going to affect our health, and they'll even affect the way we, quote, reason or think rationally. So if emotions are part of our embodied consciousness, shouldn't we attend to the pleasure, the emotional valence of the objects that we create, including, of course, our buildings, our gardens, our environment? Well, indeed, we should, partially because homeostasis, the balance of our emotions and our autonomic systems and our physical systems with the environment around us depends on us attending to the emotional qualities that we feel in the environment that we're in now. And one of the things that's quite important, and I talked about this in a recent paper for ANFA, the Neuroscience for Architecture conference, is that we actually as humans perceive place before we perceive space. Now, for architects, of course, them's fighting words, as Katie just said, I guess. Space is the medium of architecture, right? Space is what architects do. Space is what we make with. But what about place? Well, place is, for architects usually secondary. Certainly for modernists, it's secondary. Space is the medium. But in fact, for humans as animals, place means more to us than space. We don't even perceive space without a sense of where we are. We first notice if we're in a safe spot, if we're at home, if we're in a place that makes us feel good. We have a different perception of the space around us than we would in a hostile space, if we were in a dark space. Light affects our perception of space. So homeostasis and the balance of our body with our mental state is very, very important to us as human animals. And in fact, as when we are in a natural or a human-made environment, we're always attending to those emotions. And if beauty contributes to a positive emotional valence, which we know it does, we know that beautiful places always make us feel good. In fact, heart patients that are in a room with a blank wall versus one with a beautiful scene actually get better 40% faster when they have a beautiful natural scene on the wall in front of them. So we do in fact attend to beauty. We do in fact attend to the things that are causing us to feel pleasure, to feel interest. Of course, our consciousness is also has to do with our interest. Visual interest in buildings is very important. Many modernist buildings, when tested with eye movement studies, cause the eye to dart about confusingly, never light on anything. Modernist buildings have usually the entrance is concealed. There's no ornament, whereas traditional buildings make us happy. The eye goes right to where we want it to go to the doorway, to the windows, to meaningful spots on the building. And so we know from a scientific point of view how important it is to have buildings that cause us to pay attention. So why don't we, just to conclude, why don't we today get the kinds of beautiful environments that we want? Why do we have a white paper from your government that says we have to build beautiful rather than build ugly? Well, first of all, the ideologies of modernism have essentially convinced us that we can't have beautiful environments or don't want them. Secondly, we've got a capitalist system of development and wealth that places all of the emphasis on things that are not aesthetic. Of course, capitalist developers want to have cheaper space, more space for less pounds, less dollars, less euros. And also the architecture and design professions have convinced us that we can't and needn't want to have beautiful spaces. So we've got a society that essentially argues against building beautiful. How do we break out of the current malaise? Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, can we bring the presentation to a close?
Yes. I'm in fact closing right now. So, okay.
Maybe can we come back to how we deal with it all in the debate?
Sure. I said we first have to admit we were wrong. Second, look at the science. Third, look at history. And finally, reform our education. So that is the end of the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mark. And we'll be handing over to Michael Owens next. Catty, I think at the beginning, you and I were talking about whether we would have contentious views and whether we would have some opinions that differed. I'd suggest that so far we have. So I look forward to the Q&A that's going to come shortly. And
Yes.
over to Mick Owens. Yep. Can you unmute yourself, Mick? Yeah, there we go.
Can you hear me now? Good stuff. Okay.
We can hear you. Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Thanks. We're asked, should we build beautifully or should we just build? And I want to approach that question through three lenses. First of all, I want to consider questions of the public, needs and desires, and perhaps approach that a little in a bit of a different way than Mark has just done. Then I want to look at the practice of architecture and urban design, and think about the question from that point of view. And then finally, I want to consider the role of the state. I think that the moment that we're in calls into question the way in which the state has engaged with architecture and design in recent decades, and maybe just invite some exploration about how that relationship might change. So first of all, just to start with the public. Thinking about this, should we build beautifully or should we just build? It seems to me that, to the second bit of that, it's clear that we need to just build, or perhaps we need to build, and I'll come to the question of whether we should just. It's been obvious for decades that we need to build more, better and affordable homes. In my working lifetime, I can think of, at least with John Prescott in the 1990s, there's been an imperative to increase the supply of homes, and there have been targets since that time. As important, the need for the replacement of homes. Austin, who's here with us today, will tell us. When he looks at China today and looks at the rate of development in China, and there's this whole discussion about the quality of development. When you think back to the kind of speed of development and the quality of developments here in the 1960s, in the 1970s, and in the 1980s. Some of it was really poor quality, and there is a substantial need for us simply to replace homes that were built in that period. In the context of Brexit and the kind of all of the issues given by the kind of red wall, and now with COVID, it's obvious that there is a profound need for us to have a new industrial strategy, to have to rethink the economy, to reimagine what that might be. And in all of those senses, it seems to me it's self-evident that there is a need to build. But turning to the question of desire, and still thinking about this from the perspective of the public, Mark was kind of thinking about this, through kind of the lens of the brain and cognition and so on. I would sort of think of it, approach the question in a more kind of populist sense. For me, the public these days is a really opinionated lot. You think about our relationship to the built environment, at least. In relation to our private spaces, our relationship with decor, we are sophisticated. We go to IKEA and we're interested in Scandinavian design, for example. Ever since the Festival of Britain in 1951, the part of its sell was about planning and good standards of building design, good planning, and so on. But part of the sell was to do with the idea of completely reimagining the internal decor, the fit outs of kitchens, the designs of the curtains, the designs of the furniture, and so on. And this kind of embracing of the possibilities of coming out from the war and the possibilities of boom. In many ways, the kind of filmic promise, that we might have what we've seen happening in America, that we might have it over here. And I think that kind of expectation has only increased over the decades since then. And so, it's not just questions of decor. If you think about the way that, where we control our spaces, that we're constantly refitting, we're constantly, adapting, we're extending, we're doing the loft, we're doing the rear extension, we're kind of replacing the windows, and so on and so on. So I think that, in that sense, the public is sophisticated and has high expectations. The public, we watch television obsessively, we watch grand designs, we know all about it. Similarly, in relation to the public realm, we're out there in the city, we're tourists in our own cities. There in Liverpool, you will at least go to Liverpool 1, go over to the Anglican Cathedral, go over to Paddy's Wigwam, to the RC Cathedral, and you will probably know things about its design. You will know its history. You'll kind of take delight in engaging with the public realm in that way. We're visitors not in our own cities clearly, but we're out there in Europe and beyond. And so in all of that sense, I think, as consumers, we're drenched in knowledge and we have high expectations. And so there's something about the kind of about the public as, being engaged in the civic, which I think, we should think about when we relate to this question. People are confident and concerned with and opinionated about questions of beauty. So then just thinking about the terms of the debate, what concepts are out there. And again, I think Cassie's kind of, introduction was really, really good on this, but I'm just thinking about the way that the kind of terms of the debate are presented to us. And, you've already mentioned that, Sheila did an introduction, Prince Charles' intervention in the whole debate. And in his claim in the 1980s that modern architecture is basically a plague of modern carbuncles. And just as an aside here, he says that when he says that he seems to forget. He says that this beauty that is the property of the past. This kind of classic. The beauty lies in the classical and lies in tradition. He seems to forget how recently we came out of the Victorian slums, some of the monstrosities of the past that we inherited and that we've been dealing with in the modern period. That seems to have slipped from his mind. But anyway, for him, beauty is classicism. For him, it's the Anglican cathedral and not Paddy's Wigwam. It's not the RC Cathedral in Liverpool. And that same kind of rather kind of Mickey Mouse polarity, I think features in more recent debates. So not in the I think that the commission, the Building Better, Building Beautiful commission is sophisticated as a reading, but in the way that it's been received, I think that people kind of carry around that binary between the classical and the modern. But the slogans that kind of are associated with it, the kind of ask for beauty, refuse ugliness, promote stewardship, that it kind of reintroduced the idea of beauty to our imagination, and that's been reflected more recently in the planning white paper. So there is here in the UK, we've got a planning white paper that is out for consultation, and it's taken a number of its imperatives from that commission. So just to kind of to say a couple of things about my thoughts about that kind of that binary, the idea of the traditional and the modern. First of all, I don't agree that beauty is solely a property of the past. And therefore, the idea that the best that we can do in relation to beauty is to preserve it or to copy it, to replicate it in the present. And so therefore, I don't agree with Prince Charles that we should always look to classical designs and architectural traditions. It kind of carries with it this idea that there are sort of eternal rules out there, given by things like the size of our bodies. And, I think it was a bit in what Mark was saying, maybe there's something about our kind of, our brain and our cognition and so on. The idea that there are rules out there and what we need to do is to discover them. And then, if we kind of implement those rules, then we'll have something beautiful. Equally, I don't agree with the tendency to relate to modernism in exactly the same way, namely to treat modernist buildings as heritage. There are kind of these periods, and what you need to do is somehow flick through the book and choose the period that you like and do that, and it's going to be beautiful. I think there's a tendency for the kind of people who like modernism to behave in the same way, essentially, and to relate to modernism as heritage to be preserved. And so even when buildings like the Smithson building down in London, near to where Cassie works, even when they're plainly clapped out, there's a bunch of people who say that you should hang on to them because they are, they're kind of important from a heritage perspective. So heritage is okay for me, but not when it expresses a lack of confidence in the present or the future. And so I'm with Stephen Bailey when he argued as an orientation towards the modern, that you should see it as an attitude. He said, something about wanting to make the most of present possibilities, to learn from the past, but have the confidence not to ape it. So there you go. I'm on the side of of an orientation towards the modern and not being captured by tradition. That said, because Roger Scruton, the chair of the commission, is associated with conservatism, right? I don't think that I think there's a number of really important things about the work of the commission, and that we should take heed. Namely, this. I say there's a reminder in there that architecture and design are concerned with composition and with form. And I think that in a way that's obvious, right? That's what they do. You make a line, you compose. So it's kind of obvious. But I think that when you read the report, and they kind of talk about the interrelationship between the process of design and social questions. So there's a kind of parallel, if you will, between the order and composition in design and order and composition in civility. There's in social civility, there's a kind of a building stands in its context next to its neighbor, and we stand as relationships to our neighbors and people. So there are messages about order and about civility. And so, I don't agree with the kind of with a conservative reading of that, in the sense of a kind of the order comes from tradition and we need to hang on to the past and all of those things. But I do think that point that architecture and design should principally be about form and composition, that is really important. I think it's important today, given that over recent decades, there's been a real overreach in the claims of what architecture should be all about. So architecture, mental health.
For close, Mick. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So the idea that architecture should be about mental health, that it should be about sustainability, about physical health, and so on. That in a way, drawing our attention back to architecture and design as something to do with composition, I think is really important. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Mick. And certainly as we're going through the discussions, certainly contested ideas for us to discuss and different views about this. So we're going to come to our final speaker, Bob Tomlinson. As we go into this final session, audience, please think about what sorts of questions you want to put to the panel, and feel free to put those either through the chat or just raise your hands. And over to Bob. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Are we there? It's a fascinating subject, certainly listening to the other contributors to this. And it's also an enormous subject. And so I feel it's important perhaps to say where I'm coming from, where the Living Village Trust is coming from in all of this. We set the trust up in 1993 as a response really to some of the appalling housing projects that were going on in and around us. We felt a gut feeling really that there was something wrong about all of this. And so the idea behind the trust was to campaign for better housing, campaign for the improvement of local places rather than just building as the way the developers were doing. And that went on for a few years and we achieved absolutely nothing. And the reason being is because there's an awful lot of talk about this sort of thing, but the developers do their thing, the designers do their thing, and things just seem to be carrying on as they were. So we, to cut a long story very short, we actually ended up being developers ourselves and starting to build. And that really threw into light some of the problems that there are around this in terms of creating places where people want to live. And I think that it's very unhelpful in many ways to have this word beauty put into these white papers and discussion documents, because it is really something which is so difficult to pin down. Everybody's got their own opinion about it, that it actually distracts from the potential of what we could do. Now, what I'm going to try and do is go to share screen here and see if we can get the, right, can we see this? Building beauty. And now I have to work out how to move it on. Okay, so is it working? No, it's not. Come on, you can work. Okay, there we are. So as part of it, I just thought, well, what happens if I ask Google to show me pictures of beautiful people? Because that surely can't be too contentious. And what Google shows me are these lovely young people here. And Google probably knows that I'm white, male, 50s or whatever, it's 60s actually, whatever it is. But it already has producing quite a lot of different images here based on other people's perceptions or how many hits they're getting or whatever it is. So beauty is such a difficult thing to discuss out of context or out of your own personal experience. And so when the same thing I search for, look at beautiful buildings, again, there's such a wide variety of what people think of beautiful buildings based on gut feelings, based on impressions, based on things that they think they're supposed to think. You know, it's an awful lot about architecture that's trendy, and it's trendy this year and it's forgotten the next, but people will call it beautiful because they want to be seen to be trendy as well. And yet there's an awful lot of argument, history, national pride and so on about other sorts of buildings. And you can also ask any person and they'll give you a different view of it. So it's a very difficult thing to discuss in many ways. If you ask the same question, what is a beautiful house? Well, in my view, these are just the first pages of the Google search, is that these are muck mansions on the whole. This is somebody's impression of a house that is delivered partly by advertising, by expectations, by cultural, you know, by what people are supposed to have, what people have seen on television and so on, and which are ultimately probably unattainable for most of the people who have decided that this is a beautiful house. And then there's this other thing about it, who says what's a beautiful house? I think all of these pictures here are probably beautiful houses in somebody's mind's eye, but they all are all very, very different. And so for a small select group of people to tell others what is beautiful is actually something that is very problematic, probably dishonest, and probably not really going to help the situation at all, in my view. And architects and designers and urbanists and everyone tend to look at houses, design and so on quite differently to what you might call the ordinary people or the recipients of the design. And the question there is it correct that architects and professional designers should be sitting on panels deciding on what is beautiful, what should get planning and what shouldn't? And there's a bit of research here that I found fascinating, actually. David Halpern, who is part of the Cabinet Officer Behavioral Insights team at the moment, but he did this research in the 1990s, which was an experiment, which I'll read out here, is how repeated exposure to an image changed perceptions of it. And so groups of volunteer students were given images of unfamiliar people and buildings and asked them to rate them in terms of attractiveness. And some of the volunteers were architects and the rest went. And as it says here, the fascinating finding became clear as the experiment progressed. While everybody had similar views as to what is a beautiful person in terms of their faces and what people were attractive, the architecture and non-architecture students had diametrically opposed views on what was not or was an attractive building. So the architecture students favored buildings were everyone else's least favorite, and vice versa. And the longer the students or the professionals had been in architectural design, the more and more they were adverse to what was commonly thought of, or by the control group of students, were thought of as attractive buildings. And that was something that Nicholas Boyce-Smith pointed out in his various Building for Beauty documents, is that are architects and designers and professionals really the right sort of people to be deciding on what is beautiful in buildings? I'll just throw that one in there because I think that's sort of an interesting thing to look at and study. And here's that famous Robin Hood Gardens. Maybe architects do think of buildings differently, and of course they do, because they have an insight into all the complexities that it takes to design and build something. But how important is that when you're looking at delivering buildings, places that people want to live in? And that was our question to begin with when we looked at building something ourselves, was that we thought, well, we can employ architects to design a place, and we did. We employed several firms of architects to look at particular sites and come up with designs for them, and they just didn't work for us, because what we wanted to do was to build a place that was as good as the existing place and better. And when you ask people generally, or you ask Google in this instance, what is a beautiful place? Nature forms a big part of that. What people really want to see, what do they think of as beautiful places, tend to be these sorts of images. If you ask people instead what a beautiful street is, you tend to get these sorts of images. So I think these are worth looking at, because if you say this is the common thought of what beautiful streets are, they're very varied, very varied edges. No cars in these pictures, you might note. I mean, we could stroll down and find cars, I'm sure, but the pedestrian priority is a very important aspect to this. A varied edge, human scale, all sorts of things which are quite natural. I think they're probably things which can be shown by experimentation and the things that Mark was talking about earlier on. But it's a gut feeling, it's a natural thing. What do we like? What do people like? Where do people want to go? Do people want to spend more time in these sorts of places, or do they want to spend time in others? And these are the sorts of places that people tend to want to spend time in. Again, it's a similar sort of picture if you look at beautiful neighborhoods. It's friendly. It's somewhere that people want to stay, want to be. And I think one of the things I read about human beings' responses to, for example, street edges, which are just unfaceted, they're just one straight line, one slab against a pavement, makes people feel uncomfortable. And so an awful lot of modernist architecture and buildings, because of their materials, because of their simple lines, make people feel uncomfortable, make them unfriendly places. And I think that's a problem, really. And so a list of the things that perhaps are obvious from the previous slides is that what people want to see is something that's human, and they won't feel that they're going to get run over by a vehicle. They're safe, and they're safe for children and old people as well. And they encourage others to talk to each other. They encourage neighborliness, which is an important thing. And another thing about people say that you need to have green spaces. Yes, you do, but they don't have to be very big. People just like access to nature, but it can be in quite a small space. It doesn't have to be a massive park, as long as it's integrated within the street, as it were, or the places that people live. Yes, good neighbors make good neighborhoods. So designing a place that encourages good neighbors is likely to be much more successful than somewhere that's super cool and edgy and no one talks to each other, because it will become unloved and therefore unsustainable in the long term. So the way that we do that, rather than get into a great design process and work out what design is going to make people beautiful, just make places beautiful, is to, particularly if you're in development and you're building, so you're not just drawing, you're actually going to have to build something, and you're going to have to take responsibility for this, and you're going to have to find finance for a particular project. The thing that we do is just look around. If there's a site somewhere, we start looking around from that site, and we find places that have proven sustainability. They're places where people have lived in for many generations, and they've enjoyed living there enough to keep those houses maintained and working. And then there will be other places that are obviously at the bottom end of the desirability scale, and we look at what is causing that as well. What are the elements that cause these places to be abandoned or lived in by people who don't really have a lot of choice? And this was also important to us because when you are in the process of development, you have to raise the finance for it. You have to substantiate the financial appraisals for the sites. You've got to say, these are the sorts of places that people want to live. They are paying this much per square foot for it. That means they're desirable. That means that we can include a lot of affordable housing in here because of the payoff from desirability to being able to support the affordability of it. So what are the elements of these places? How do we bring them in? Now, this might be contentious because I've only been to Liverpool when I was about 3 years old, so it's not really. And so that would be the sort of question that we would ask. And I asked Google of it, and you've probably all got very different opinions. And so I thought it was a bit of a risky slide to show here. But anyway, Google came up with this. I mean, I don't know whether people agree with that or not. But there you go. And so I've no idea, but they look quite nice to me. And that would be the sort of thing to start with. Okay, what makes it, why have these places popped up on this survey? If you have a site in Liverpool, perhaps it's important to look at why they've popped up. And I think it's the Liverpool Echo that produced these. And start from there. What is it that's making these places desirable? Worst place to live in Liverpool? I don't know. I haven't got a picture of them actually. I thought that was even more dangerous to do. But is to find out what is it that people don't like about it, and it may be very practical stuff, but the way will also be design elements in there. Where are the places? I mean, I hear that there are buildings in Liverpool, tower blocks particularly, which are only a couple of decades old, which have been demolished because they were such terrible places to live. So you've got to work out why that was and not do it again, because that's an enormous waste of resources. It's very, very unsustainable, and it's not something that should be repeated.
Can I ask you to draw to a conclusion?
Yeah, this is what we did, the Wentals. It's one of the developments that we did. We had to go out and get the money from NatWest Bank, and we had to prove to them that it was all going to work. Now, this is Bishop's Castle, where the Wentals is. People like living in Bishop's Castle. They enjoy it. It's very robust. It's been a very vibrant, sustainable community for about 2,000 years. And so you can see all the elements going on in there. How do you repeat those? How do you get those to work with building regulations and wheelchair access and all those sorts of things? And that's what we ended up doing, is something similar, but it's energy efficient, it's very light, and it's got all the advantages of modern buildings. So it's looking at the patterns of buildings, and it's that space between the buildings, which is in fact more important than the buildings themselves. Get that space right, get the small details, the edge effect right, and the buildings actually are subordinate to that if you're placemaking and neighborhood making. Just very quickly then, fast track to beauty proposals, that was in the white paper. How on earth are they going to do that? It's enormous. Economics I've talked about. You need to get the economics right, otherwise you can't build anything successfully. I was intrigued by this picture on the front of the white paper. What on earth is going on there? I really don't know. It's an odd one. And then just to get people to think a little bit about some of the things, there was this photograph in the white paper as well. The buildings behind there, if you look at them, you think, oh, well, that's not really too bad. But the thing, or is it? I mean, or is it grotesque? I'm not sure. Those, it looks a bit grim to me. But the thing that's key about this photograph, when you look at it, what is it trying to say here? What is the whole thing here? And to me, it's this. it's this guy here sitting on a bench under a nice tree with water in front of them. And that's what that makes that place livable. If these towers and drums and whatever were surrounded by a tarmac or a car park or something, that would make that place very, very uncomfortable. The fact it's got a tree and a bench and a sort of space where you might sit makes it work. And that's it from me.
Okay, Bob, thank you very much for that. And can you...
I'm back.
Right. Okay. So thank you to the panel. I'm going to ask the audience to put forward some questions. We can take them in groups. You can, I'll ask individuals or each of the panel to respond. But just before that, so a 60-second summary, what I heard. Katie made a plea for more investment in the planning process. As a qualified town planner, I was really pleased to hear that she wanted more planners in the system. Mark suggested at one point that modernism actually rejects beauty, and we began to edge towards that discussion of tradition versus modernism, and the idea that modernist designs confuse us, I found interesting. Mick highlighted the monstrosities of the past, and again started to highlight this traditional versus modern discussion, and the idea that beauty is not solely in the past, and are we obsessed with nostalgia about the past in this country? And Bob, I think at one point you were suggesting that the word beauty itself is extremely unhelpful in the white paper. And indeed, we've all got different thoughts about what this word beauty means in the built environment. But just for a moment, as we think about the questions, what is the problem we're trying to solve here? So just to remind us that in this country, apparently we need 1 million new homes building, and it's become quite urgent for these 1 million homes to be built. And Boris has said over the next 5 years, his changes in the planning system and other changes with modular construction, for instance, that all of these changes are going to enable 1 million homes to be built over the next 5 years. You can sense my skepticism in that statement. But can I ask people to start raising their hands or to indicate to me through one form or another, as I can't see everybody's body language, if they want to ask a question? Anybody out there? Everybody's very quiet. Ah, Austin. So go ahead, Austin.
Great, thanks very much. Fascinating discussion, I have to say. I thought it might be just a straightforwardly political conversation, but actually it had such variety that I was really intrigued. So thank you, everybody. And it also then confuses me as to where to start on this conversation, because there was 4 aspects which I kind of disagreed with everybody, I suppose. But so the first thing is, if I just go through, if you don't mind,
yes, that would be great.
Then, because in terms of the way Katie presented it, I was very interested in almost her scientific approach to it, with that kind of Venn diagram of what beauty is and what it isn't, which kind of is very much of the moment, isn't it? That actually you can define it. And very often, as you were doing, Katie, bringing into call these kind of social, political factors, you know, that it's beautiful if it's sustainable, or it's good if it's sustainable. Whereas personally, I don't necessarily kind of see aesthetic merit in sustainability or all these kind of social factors. As a matter of fact, I've seen some bloody awful civic places which are deemed to be good because they are sustainable. And I don't think it works in a cold calculus kind of way like that. So it would be interesting to kind of see you develop that a little bit more, if you wouldn't mind. In terms of what Mark was saying, I mean, no offense, Mark, but I fundamentally disagree with you, but that's okay, because you fundamentally disagree with me. I mean, I was just thinking when you were talking about plumage, you know, and birds, and how humans are the same as animals in many respects. I was kind of thinking about, you know, animals which have plumage, kind of, it's not the same as somebody going out and choosing their outfit in a shop or for a Saturday night out, is it? I mean, you're kind of born with it, you live with it, you suffer it, you stick with it, and that's it. And the transformation, the kind of that kind of biological determinism, which ignores the transformative nature, using the word nature very loosely, the transformative impact of humanity on our environment, the ability to transform nature, the idea of human consciousness, and the ability to transform, you know, show me a sheep living in a decent city created by other sheep, and I might buy into it. But so I think that there's the ability to transform nature is fundamental to what humanity has. And as you can probably tell, I'm a modernist, but not in a nostalgic sense. You know, I believe in that ability to kind of change the world rather than maybe just kind of live with it. So, I mean, again, so I mean, I'm sure I parodied you there, Mark, so apologies for that, but please come back to me. In terms of what Mick was arguing, I think it's kind of important. I just want you to develop, because you ran out of time, or you ran out of steam when you raised your own question about how you kind of look as a you know, a future thinking, future orientated designer, how you then look back on the fact that many people see beauty in a historically appropriate sense. So there is a respect and an admiration and a hankering in some respects for that kind of the old way of doing things. So again, I just wanted you to give me some idea about how you play those two off, really. And then Bob, I really liked your presentation, very interesting. I think for me, it was a little bit of kind of Google search is all very well and good. I agree with that. It kind of ticks the box. That's very useful. But I think that, again, the kind of transformative nature about the way that we see the possibilities of changing the world is very reminiscent of garden cities and that kind of you know, end of the 19th century city beautiful movement in America, which you were kind of hinting at in terms of your placemaking agenda. But that, for me, at the end of the last century, or the previous century, the 19th century, there was a sense of people being demoralized or disenfranchised or worried about the way the direction of society was going. And there was a kind of a belief in the past, you know, the romantic ideal of countryside and clean air and all the rest of it against the kind of smokestacks of Victorian Britain. And you can, but the future orientated modernists, no offense, future orientated designers won out in a progressive sense, taking society forward. I think what you have today is you don't have that future oriented sense. There is no, you know, I can't see a future vision presented by anybody. I can't see a new style of architecture or a new vision of the future. And therefore all we kind of have is a retreat into the past, into people sitting under trees, you know, eating their sandwich lunches and making out that that's some kind of rural idyll. So I'm slightly kind of worried that that's a reactionary, in the political sense, a reactionary statement rather than a future-orientated, ambitious statement, which I think maybe this claim for you know, new designs and new styles could bring to the fore. So I think that we're caught up in all of those ambitions. I think we're caught up in beauty in a political, historical context, and we're looking to beauty as something which gives us stability in the past and some sense of certainty, rather than maybe taking the risk and designing something like maybe the modernists did, which weren't pretty, but actually had an agenda. And I'm, by the way, I'm not lauding the modernists. I think there were lots of rubbish modernism as well, right? But I think the agenda and the ambitions behind it was something which gave it some kind of solidity. Sorry to go on. Thank you.
No, thank you, Austin, because clearly there's a question for each of the panelists there. But before I come back to the panelists, Pauline, you wanted to comment on beauty. You unmute yourself, Pauline. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I really enjoyed that, and it's great not to be chairing it, so I can actually enjoy it and you know, put some ideas forward myself in a way, take a side, if you like. I'm interested in the different kind of definitions of beauty and what it is, because it's really fascinating to hear all these different takes on it. And what I kind of got out of that was that it is something that's, it seems to be that people talk about beauty in terms of things that are familiar, but also things that are idealized as well. So there's a kind of combination of what we know and what we aspire or dream of. And I'm also very much, you know, living in Britain at this moment, in Liverpool, struck by the how much ugliness there is around us as a sort of just daily feature of our lives, and how things seem to be shabby and broken down looking, how streets seem to be grubby, and there's a sort of grimness that I think people have got used to and become quite familiar with, in a sense that we just accept it. So I'm a big, I would be someone who would like to see greater thought and concern and a kind of return to making beauty something that matters in people's lives. But I am actually then, I think, however, the familiarity that we have with just everyday ugliness is really the problem that I want to put forward. And I wondered if it is that there's two explanations. One is that it's a kind of result of a kind of economic decline and also market forces that someone mentioned, where buildings are just built small and cheap and poor quality. Or has there been a suspicion? Is there a suspicion of beauty? And is there a desire, perhaps, among, it's certainly very strong in modernism, to disrupt the familiar and to use this disruption of the familiar as a way of kind of making a political statement or disrupting our sense of what is normal, trying to make us think about our surroundings. And I wonder if we can reclaim beauty as something that is potentially disruptive and forward-looking, rather than being something that simply feeds this or kind of nourishes this sense of what is familiar and safe for us.
Thank you, Pauline. So panelists, you've had about 50 questions from Austin and Pauline there. So just hold those. I'm going to take one more member of the audience, Kenneth Haywood, if you can make your points, and then I'll come back to the panel, and feel free, panel, to pick and choose between those questions. So Kenneth, are you there? Do you need to unmute, Kenneth? Oh, where were this? Does that work? No?
Oh yeah, there we go.
There we go, Kenneth, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So I think I have to agree with Bob most. I think he hit the nail on the head by asking the question, what is beautiful? I certainly think in the current economic crisis that we're in, that affordable housing is certainly going to be the future for the foreseeable future. The one problem that is it gives people the excuse to build things on the cheap, forego any sort of design reviews, and hide behind almost like a veil of community. So the layout of the housing is put to us in a way that we're meant to think that it's building a community around us, but beauty in a sense has gone completely out of the window. Now, that I certainly think changes from region to region, whereas I'm quite glad that he pointed out that Prescott's the most beautiful place in Liverpool, because I live right round the corner from there, where the and one project that's been done recently in the local area is called Water Tower Drive. Now, that's taken affordable housing around that area, but in the same aspect, it's taken an old water tower and turned it into modern, not quite affordable living, but it's all centered around that. And it's what I call myself as, well, I'd call it beautiful. Whereas you go 30 miles down the road, 30 miles down the M62, you get to a different area. The houses have taken a different step. They're not in the same design. They're still classed as affordable living, but they've taken small aspects like sandstone cladding to fit in with the local area, the local countryside, so to speak. But when it comes to the future, we're starting to talk more and more about how we affect the climate around us. And it seems to me that, again, design goes out of the window. We're bolting photovoltaic cells to the tops of buildings, and they are ugly as sin. But I want to ask the panel, where do they see that going? Are we just going to keep that thick line straight down the middle of design and functionability, or going to start allowing engineering to work with designers, architects, in order to make beautiful?
Thank you, Kenneth. Okay, so if I go back to the panel in the order that you presented, so Catty, don't feel you have to answer every single question, just pick out a few. Yeah.
So actually, in response to both Austin and Kenneth, I was trying to differentiate between measurable elements of design, such as sustainability, etc., which we might call good design, and beauty, and trying to say that actually something that's good design, functionally well, super sustainable, maybe even creates a great place, is not necessarily beautiful. And beauty is a subset within it, and it's something that we should be striving for within it, but it's very difficult to measure it. I mean, I would say there is definitely a very strong movement currently to go back to thinking about people first, then places and buildings last, and everybody's talking about placemaking. I mean, every single project you come across talks about placemaking, and I think in terms of the economics, developers are now beginning to take that into account. And I was talking to you and I, who are big developers, and they were saying in their developments where they've given up a lot of their ground floors for amenities, retail, creating great places for their residents, they are already on their balance sheets upping the values of those residential units. So they are quantifying the value of great placemaking. But I equally think, just to be a little bit controversial, great placemaking does not necessarily make beautiful places. I've been in quite a few maybe more modern towns in Europe. I mean, in Europe, particularly with the work of somebody like Jan Gale, placemaking is really at the heart of their cities and their town centres, amazing places for people, and it's not very beautiful, some of them. Some of them are, some of them are not. So I think it's very, very different. Can I throw in a hand grenade as a finishing off thing, which is, I think Mark said, and I wrote it down because I thought it was quite a bold statement: traditional buildings make us happy. And I think it's actually, and there's been a lot of talk about style and beauty, and actually I think the notion of style and era and heritage is a bit lazy, to be quite frank, talking about beauty. And we should really be looking at each individual place and building on its own, rather than generalizing in terms of whether something historic is beautiful or whether something modern is beautiful. Where actually both can be both beautiful and ugly.
Thank you, Catty. Mark, do you want to respond to some of the challenges there? Unmute.
Yes. Did you just unmute me? Thank you.
I did.
Thank you. All right, sorry. Well, first, to answer the idea that I did misspeak, not only traditional places are beautiful, there are wonderful modern buildings, virtually everything by Alvar Aalto, almost everything by Luc Kahn. They're magnificent modern buildings, and I studied as a modernist. So I'm not saying that beauty is is something only in traditional environments, although more places, more cities, and the most beautiful cities in the world are all traditional cities. Chandigarh has not turned out to be very beautiful, neither is Brasilia, neither has Milton Keynes. So the city makers have, in fact, the urban design and new urbanists have, in fact, a good point that we have traditional cities as models of beautiful spaces and streets. We don't have many models of modernist cities. I want to go back to what Bob and Austin were saying about whether animals and humans can ornament their environments. I'm not suggesting that sheep are going to re-dye their wool or in patterns, although perhaps if they had the ability, they might do so. But it does turn out that when animals are in environments that make them feel good, they do. There are measurable ways in which they feel good, and indeed, Nicholas Boy-Smith, who was part of what's called the Place Science Group in Stockholm in 2018, with me, we are going to be testing using EEG and various kinds of headsets how people react to streets that we think are beautiful, that have been appeared on the best dressed lists or the most beautiful street lists in Europe. We will be able to, and scientists will be able to test how people feel in those particular environments. And we will find, I can almost guarantee you that we will find that the streets of Bath are going to feel more beautiful than the streets in the air of Robin Hood Gardens, even though the Smithsons suggest that those streets in the air would have worked perfectly well. Now, of course, are there modern streets that will test beautiful? Yes, there are. So, but one thing that I think should be understood, and I'll just leave you with this particular thought, is that there are scientists out there, there are brain scientists out there at ANFA in San Diego, who are going to try in the next 25 years or so to figure out whether there are standards of beauty that are universal. And they're going to test them. They're going to test them in various kinds of ways. Unfortunately, nowadays, they don't speak architects, so they're not working very well with us as architects to figure out how to test aesthetics. But once we get together on this, there will, in fact, be measurable ways of showing what things affect us perceptually in terms of our sensations and our intellect, what things actually will create the feeling of beauty and the understanding of beauty in human beings. And they're things that animals also appreciate, and they're things that can be measured. So watch that place which is called ANFA, and you will find that I think that many aspects of classical aesthetics will be proven to be universal. I can't guarantee this, but classical Indian design, classical Chinese design, classical Greek design, many forms of traditional design will in fact prove that the brain functions in a certain way and that there are aesthetic principles that are universal. That doesn't mean, however, to go back to Austin's point, that genius, that artistic genius, follows rules. No, it does not. When artistic genius comes into play, artists make beautiful things that don't follow the rules, and those are the kinds of things that I think all of us would like to think will continue to happen in the future. Thank you.
Thank you for the response. Nick, over to you. Well, there's some points there raised in the questions from Austin, Pauline, and Kenneth that you want to respond to at all? And hang on.
How's that?
That's good.
Let's
go ahead. Yeah.
So yeah, Austin said, well, look, if you're keen to promote a sort of future-facing attitude towards the question of building and indeed the question of beauty, then how do you reconcile with that with the fact that so often culturally we look to all of our examples of beauty in the past, and that becomes our reference points. I think that the answer to that is a material question. Actually, I think that we've lived through a time, in which the idea that we would intervene, certainly, that the public would intervene, that our government would intervene and would play a leading role in development, that it hasn't been like that. So I would say that in a certain sense, there's a kind of a subjective side to the answer. That partly you need to be confident, don't you, to think, to experiment and to innovate, and to kind of engage with the possibilities given by the technology that is at our disposal. Implies a certain confidence, but I would say that if we do, if we can get a government which kind of bites the bullet, imagine if we were indeed planning city extensions, even building new cities to kind of supply those million new homes that Sheila mentioned earlier on. Then the idea of experimentation wouldn't just be a thought experiment. It would be a real material, concrete thing to do. And I think that in the course of that, sure, we can take what's been good about the past and we can do it again. No problem with that. But equally, I think that we would come across new possibilities, and I think there's so much kind of, if you think about the technical capabilities that are available to us, given the kind of developments in terms of design, in terms of analysis, in terms of materials, in terms of new forms of construction, off-site construction, modular, and so on. There's so much to experiment with, and we haven't done it, because we haven't kind of got on with it. So I would say, the answer to that is a material one.
Okay, thank you, Mick. Bob, are there some questions that you can respond to?
Yes. Again, it's such an enormous subject, isn't it? Quite how to sum this up. Beauty is subjective, so it's not really, or it shouldn't be within the power of the designers to decide what is beautiful. They should look at what is enjoyed, loved, and is therefore sustainable around them, and then improve on that. I think a lot of the projects, the living spaces and so on, which have failed are because of egos, because of the designer's ego, to produce something that's extraordinary and so on and so forth, which is great, which is good, and that should be done. But when you're dealing with people's lives, in some cases, many, many people's lives, you need to be more caring than that. It's all very well to produce a wonderful work of art, which is looked at and breaks all the boundaries and everything else. But if you're producing a place for people to live, you should really make sure that they're going to enjoy living there. Otherwise, it's going to be abandoned and it's going to be demolished within a couple of decades. So you've wasted your time. So it's again, look and learn. Really look closely at these things and work out how to make them better.
Okay. I'm just aware there were a couple of questions, especially Pauline and Kenneth's contributions. I'm just wondering if anybody wants to volunteer from the panel with response to this question of, I think, maintenance, basically. So there's a lot of focus in planning policy about what we build next. Given our record in certain cities about actually looking after heritage in the past, does anyone of the panel want to respond to those questions around heritage and maintenance? Mark, I'll just unmute you. Go ahead, Mark.
Yes. I've actually spent most of my career in building conservation, and I will probably be looking at a book about adaptive reuse. I think it's important that as you look to build 1 million units of new housing, that you look at adaptive reuse as one of the main aspects to explore. And it has not been explored much by the technologists because, of course, people think of old buildings as not being technologically fixable. In fact, old buildings, of course, are the greenest buildings because they have embodied energy in them. And I think that it would be a mistake in Britain, as it has been in the United States, to ignore the fact that we have good older buildings, including buildings that were not housing. Most of Wall Street, of course, is now housing, used to be offices. We have good buildings everywhere, and we have good buildings in good places, places that people love, that can be converted into housing and can be converted if architects understand the way in which those traditional buildings operate, respecting them, putting the new technology in such a way that it's not kind of obstreperous and ruins the buildings. And I think that's really a strategy where heritage can pay off. These buildings are exemplary in the sense that we've loved them, so let's keep them.
Okay, so that idea of adaptive reuse and providing 1 million units through adaptations, or a good proportion.
Well, not all. I mean, Peter Head of Arup said that we really only need, before 2040, Arup said we only need 50% new building to take care of all the needs of the world. So if we used 30% existing buildings, we'd be fine.
Thanks for that, Mark. Thank you. Nick?
Yeah, again, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, first of all, I think that it's good that Kenneth raises the question of cost, and you know, in a way, to me, it speaks to the kind of the need for expertise, the need for sophistication on the part of the architect and the designer. So, you know, far from seeing them as arrogant, they need to be really skilled to balance all of the competing needs that come about in achieving a simple and good solution. And cost is a really important factor. I do think that if we had cost as another kind of bubble on Cathy's kind of Venn diagram early on, that it's not necessarily you don't necessarily have to counterpose good design with cost. I think that there are solutions to caricature the whole thing. You can have a caravan site that has a beauty to it in terms of the arrangement of the pieces within the caravan site and its relationship to nature. But you kind of get the points in there. So good design is not necessarily counterposed to cost. However, delivering to a requirement for mass housing is really expensive. But I would say that if you approach that job with confidence, then all of a sudden there is the possibility, isn't there, to open up new points of production. Really interesting for us to generate new kinds of skills. And again, I would say that the response to the question of cost implies the need for innovation, and I would do that at the level of the economy as well as at the level of design.
Okay, thanks for that. Bob? Cathy, did you want to respond to any of those points about maintenance or adaptation of existing buildings in the country?
Sure. I mean, adaptation of existing buildings is absolutely key, as was said just now about the embodied carbon and maintaining those, and creative reuse can make really interesting buildings. Urban Splash have been doing that for years, taking old buildings and creating new ones out of it. So I think that is something that we should definitely be focusing on, and it's not just for housing, it's for all sorts of buildings that have met their end of life and having new types of uses going into them. So I think that's a really important element of design moving forwards, and actually you need to be more creative to make it work. In terms of cost, I completely agree with Mick that good design does not mean expensive design. I think, again, that those two don't necessarily have to go hand in hand. You can get great affordable design. Equally, you can get really rubbish expensive design. So these kind of polarizations, I think, are just not very helpful in terms of the design discussion and the place of beauty within it.
Okay. Bob, anything to add on that?
Just that the existing buildings are usually in the best places. One of the problems with building new is that you're finding sites which aren't very pleasant in the first place. So refurbishment use old buildings is very important, and also the places that they then are sitting on and creating. So fundamentally, yes.
This question of reuse and adaptation of existing buildings, of course, there's the whole economic conditions that brought this about. I can remember when the idea of living in a converted mill was complete anathema to a generation of people who had worked in mills, and then they somehow got reinvented and became trendy in certain cities in this country. And with the announcements about redundant retail shopping malls, I do wonder what's going to happen to some of our big shopping malls over the next 5 to 10 years. Again, complete anathema to me to consider I might in my old age live in an adapted Topshop, but you know, who knows? Austin, were you waving your hand? I'll unmute you. Hang on. Oh, there's just a little time delay. Hang on. There you go.
Okay. Hello. I'm with you. Very quickly, because I just thought that Katie did come back, even though she denied it at the very beginning, has now moved off beauty and has moved full square into cost-benefit analyses on you know, what is good. And the idea that, you know, sustainable or somehow adaptable reuse somehow is inherently good. I don't get it myself. I mean, obviously, if you're thinking about saving carbon, if you're thinking about, you know, using an empty building, then fair enough, I understand it. But I don't necessarily think it's good or admirable. And I think more buildings are needed. That report, which said that we have enough buildings in the world, is the death knell of architectural jobs, but also it's a recipe for complete emotional and personal and social stasis. So I'm not in favour of that. The main thing I wanted to say was I thought Bob's point, which I kind of was in passing, which was looking at this idea of expertise. And there was that kind of conversation a few years ago, criticising movie reviewers or literature reviewers and saying, you know, what do they know? Why are they paid so much? When in fact you can go on a blog site now and there's hundreds of people telling you what a really good movie is, and maybe they know better than somebody else. And so it's that distinction between personal and expert opinion on this issue of beauty or what is meritorious is essential here, because I think there is something to be said for the fact that architects know more about architecture than the public. Now that might sound fascistic, which is not the intention, but I know, but there is a truth that, you know, that people have studied things, people have studied art know more about art than I do, or music or whatever it might be. And I think that there is something which we have to recognize, that people who know more then can offer more. And the purpose of an architect is to take a client on a journey from their ambitions to give them better ambitions or more structured ambitions or whatever it might be, or more beautiful ambitions. So it's that kind of striving for improvement, which I think is fundamental to this. Just moving on very quickly, because I think the mention of China, there was an example in Beijing 20 years ago where Beijing postcards, which sold 100-year-old postcards of old imperial China, opened up, and the shop got attacked by local residents, threw bricks through the window, and they attacked the owners for reminding Chinese people about the old, dirty, poverty-stricken ways of China, where they wanted to be seen as this new kind of world-leading economy. Within 5 years, that shop is now seeing record takings, because people are now beginning to think, you've destroyed my old Beijing, and you've given me these high-rise monstrosities, and we actually now want to have a memory of what we've lost and all the rest of it. So there's a movement, a transience in this conversation as well, which I think is worthwhile considering. But I also think that there is a truth to the fact that as a hallmark in some ways of a canon of a civilized society, there are certain things which we should learn from. Even just to go back to the arch modernist of Trotsky, Trotsky made a great play of the fact when revolutionaries at the end of the Russian Revolution wanted to destroy the old canon of literature. He told them to read it, learn from it, take it forward and develop it, rather than just destroying it out of hand in a Philistine sense. So I think there is something, again, more nuanced here than maybe even I'm trying to get across, which is that there is a hallmark of a civilized society which will not knock down St. Paul's. It will, you know, retain it as it has some historical and inherent value in it.
Austin, thank you so much. I'm going to take questions from Rachel and then Mo, and then I'm going to ask each of the panel to sum up as best they can. It's literally only a minute in terms of making your final statements about all the aspects we've discussed. So Rachel, can I ask you to make your points?
Hi, I'm coming at this as not as an architect or a urban planner, but just someone who, well, I'm very interested in art, and I've lived in Singapore for 10 years and also London, and I have a friend who lives in Marmalade Lane housing in Cambridge, this eco development. So I feel like I've had quite a good view or personal experience of different types of residential housing. So having lived in Singapore, I would say that the contrast between there and here is enormous. And, you know, what Pauline said about us being used to grubbiness, you know, that obviously, I mean, Singapore is incredibly sort of organized and clean and whatever, but there is a real difference. And, you know, I mean, where I live now, small town in Essex, the local shopping centre has been there since the 1970s. You know, nothing has changed, and it's just like, I just can't believe it when I walk around, not just here but in other towns. And obviously London is a bit of an exception in this, but you know, it's like, obviously it's the lack of investment, but I sort of can't help wondering, is there, you know, there is this lack of vision as well, because, you know, it's like, surely, like Mick was arguing, you know, we can innovate more. There are so many materials available to us. There are so many other societies or governments that we could look to for ideas and inspiration. And, you know, honestly, in terms of the idea of the beauty being subjective, I mean, yeah, I agree with that. But I feel that given the sort of problem of homelessness in this country, you know, I think that right now it's sort of linked to, surely your idea of beauty or an individual's idea of beauty is going to be linked to their means, their financial means. Because if you're a homeless person, if you're offered a tiny home, which I don't think is the right solution ultimately, but you know, you're going to think that is a great place to live. You're going to like it because you're not living on the street anymore, you know. And it's sort of all the way up from homelessness, all the way up. So yeah, I don't know how to solve it, but for sure I think that money and the sort of need for investment is one of the most major factors, plus the need of more vision.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you. Mo, did you have some comments?
Yeah, I do. There's sort of a mishmash of comments because, like everybody else, I found the four speakers utterly fascinating. So there's probably a question in here somewhere, and it's a little bit riffing on what Austin was saying. But just funny enough, what Rachel said, when I lived in South Africa for a while, just as we were going through the kind of big post-apartheid building thing to get rid of all the kind of townships and build CDC housing, I think they called it, and it was very cheap. Put up very, very quickly, and much nicer than obviously the shanty towns that people had been used to. And what happened in a lot of places was that the people who lived in the townships, they got given their government house, which they rented out and just stayed in the township because they didn't want to leave their community, and it was a way of making money. So there's something in there about not just building a load of cheap houses quickly because we need it. There is something in the kind of planning it around what people need, which I kind of come on to in a minute. But my niece is, I'm not an architect, but my niece is in her second year studying for an architecture degree, and she often asks me, she's dyslexic, and asks me to look at her essays to help with the kind of dyslexia. And what's really interesting is I'm always going back to it to talk about what the aesthetic is, what style does she like, because I come from an artsy background. And she always says it's about sustainability. I want to be a sustainable architect. That's what she talks about. And it seems to me her course is doing a lot about making an equivalence between sustainability and aesthetics, which I thought Michael made such a lovely point about architecture and design being about composition and form, because that does feel like very familiar territory to me as somebody who's been in the arts. And what's happening in the arts sector is that composition and form and those kind of universal values that Mark was talking about or universal frameworks have given way to much more instrumental kind of art has to be a social good. It has to have an instrumental value. It can't just be beautiful in its own sake. So that brings me back to this thought about town planning, because I grew up in a 1970s new town that was planned very carefully. You can go from one end of my town to another without ever crossing a road, because it was built for young families and women with pushchairs who would stay at home while dad went out. And it was kind of built with that kind of vision of 1970s Britain in it. And I used to call it the Milton Keynes of the North, because I thought it was so bloody horrible. Couldn't wait to get out. I've just moved back, and I love it. I love it now because it's grown up. It's become something, and it is still based around people, and you can still cycle everywhere, and it's just lovely. And so I just was curious to Bob's point about the experts was fascinating. That the experts don't necessarily know. They don't agree with kind of what other people see as beautiful in terms of housing. So, but that town planning stuff was all done with public consultation, wasn't it, in terms of how many sports fields you needed and how many art centres you needed and stuff. So I just wonder if there's something to be said for learning from that past about town, whilst accepting what a lot of people said about where is the vision in a kind of post-structural society. Okay.
There's a lot you've raised there, Mo. I'm going to ask each of the panel to summarise to help us finish off the discussion. Obviously, all of you came from different perspectives, but Mo, certainly that idea of what we can learn from the past, it troubles me that we do actually know how to build houses, we know how to build new towns, we know how to what are the blockages, what is really stopping us from doing this. And I'm supposed to be a neutral chair, but I do worry that beauty is another obstacle in the process. And this idea of planned beauty that seems imminent, again, raises questions. But thank you, everybody, for your comments and questions. I'm sorry we haven't been able to respond to every single one of them. And in the chat as well, Emma has been making some really good points about the role of construction in all of this as well. It's not just what the designs are on the table. So can I ask each of the panel in the order that they spoke, starting with Catty then, to do your best to summarise, maybe 2 minutes rather than one. Yeah.
Okay, so my big thing is style is not the issue here. Elements like sustainability, etc., should be embedded in the design the same way that we don't talk about whether a building stands up or not. We shouldn't be talking about whether a building is sustainable or not, because quite frankly, it should just inherently be that, and that shouldn't be necessarily driving the design in its absolute sense. I also wrote down here we should aim for beauty, but hoping that we're going to end up with a good design, because I think the two things are slightly different, and also a design which is well maintained. I thought that was a really good point that was made. And lastly, in terms of in relation to housing, I think the connection between place and building is really important, not just in terms of greenery, etc., but actually because especially as has been shown in the last year, nobody really wants to live in a housing development where there are just houses. Everybody's talking about the 15-minute city, walkable cities, all that. We want to be in communities who work, live and play. And I think that's the thing that we find attractive about maybe more historical town centres, because it's that mix of density and uses that we like rather than the style.
Thank you, Catty. Moving on to Mark.
Yes, following on Catty's point about style, I find the polarities that have gotten us tripped up around style, modern versus traditional, modern versus classical, and lots of other polarities, political ones as well, to be much in the way of a proper discussion of all this, and that's one of the reasons why I think that, and certainly in the UK, the classical versus modern is is much more polarizing than it is in the US, mainly, I think, because of the prints, alas. But we can get beyond that if we use terms like beauty in ways that are, in fact, much more universal. And that's what science can help us to do. Science can actually help us to figure out whether in our perception, in our intellectual appreciation of the environment, in how we feel the environment, how we see the environment, how we move through the environment, if there are things about architecture that we can quantify and also qualify using research that allow us to make better environments that people are going to be able to appreciate in terms of their intellectual, their sensory qualities, and thereby see them as more beautiful, then that's what we should do. The other reason that beauty is a good thing to bring in is because the public, as Mick was suggesting, and Bob, the public understand what they think beauty is, whether it's in the eye of the beholder or not. There are ways in which the general public will respond to a word like beauty, where they won't respond to critical theory or conceptualism or all sorts of terms that architects tend to use, the jargon of the present. We should bring back terms that people really respond to. And if beauty is a term that people respond to, and if people think they understand it, and we can actually ask them what is beautiful or ask them whether they like being in one place over another, which we can do, and of course Bob's people have done that, and in fact many housing developers in the US do the same thing. Where would you like to live? Well, I want to live in a beautiful neighborhood. Well, if you can identify that using a term like beauty, then let's use it. Let's not throw out terms that have, let's say, popular or universal appeal to them. So those are the two things I think are important: whether beauty can be qualified and quantified, and whether it can also be something that the popular imagination understands.
Thank you for that, Mark. Thank you very much. Mick.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, first of all, just on adaptability, right? So you sure there's a thing about the past, and I quite like Urban Splash's work. I like the irreverence in relation to the past, actually. So, like, if it works okay in relation to today's circumstances, then we'll keep it. But we won't be shy about adding a lump of glass to an old brick warehouse. We're kind of so it seems to me there's a kind of confidence, a kind of panache about their work that I quite like. But I think there are kind of interesting questions about the future, because it seems to me the key thing, in relation to the future, is that it's unknown, and we can't proceed as if there's this kind of beautiful form and we do it and then everything's finished. So that can be kind of banal and profound, if you like it, at the more kind of everyday level. For us at Bow Arts Trust, it's important, that people don't kind of over design the spaces that we get, because we want to kind of subdivide spaces and then subdivide them differently in a little time. And I think there's pieces of technology, for example, from theatre set movements that you can apply, fairly simply to big spaces that can work well in the future. So I think it seems to me the idea of building in flexibility to allow changes over time is one of those kind of technological challenges principally for the construction industry. I've kind of mostly focused on the idea that the state should change and stop being a regulatory state and be more of a doing state, is what I've emphasized. Which implies being hands-on. It implies that you'll be able to take land, and kind of do what you need to get things done. It's kind of interventionist and all of that. But I do think there's a kind of flip side to it, and I loved so Eugene and Hammy. Eugene says, I quite like a bit of ugly, he says in the chat box. and that kind of chimed with me in this sense that sometimes you want the kind of regulatory state to just get out of the way, you know, and so it seems to me we need to have we need to also proceed with the confidence that allows clients, people who own land and own buildings, to get really close to their architects and designers, you know, and because it seems to me that a good relationship at that level will result in good projects. So it seems to me, as well as being kind of hands-on and making conditions, you also need this kind of loose framework and to allow chance and allow people just to do stuff and to be able to experiment.
Thank you, Mick. The idea of the regulatory state stepping back is something I think we're all concerned about at the moment. Bob, it falls to you for the last couple of minutes.
Okay, for me, if you're going to build something, if you're going to design something, then it's nice to think that it's going to be around for several, if not many generations. And the only way that something is going to be, it's an overused word, isn't it, sustainable, is to design and build buildings that are loved by the people who use them, whether they live in them or use them for employment or whatever. And therefore, again, it's just really important to get underneath all of that and find out what it is that makes people love those buildings and those places, and then use that information to design better and keep the ego out of it. Okay, it's not for the designer, it's for the people who are going to use those buildings that it's important. And if you get that right, then the funding follows. So it's a win-win situation. And that's my bit.
Thank you for that brevity, Bob. So I think it has actually now gone 9 o'clock. So I'm not sure I've chaired this effectively, because I think we were going to finish a while back. But thank you to all of the audience and the participants for staying with this subject. And indeed for everybody on the panel who brought such different perspectives to, at first reading might seem quite straightforward debate, but actually there's a lot of layers to it. And I'm certainly left with more questions than answers at the end of it. But I think the built environment it's a complex set of processes that we've all been working with. So thank you to everybody. And I'm going to hand back to Pauline, who just wants to talk a bit about what's next for the Liverpool Salon as well. So